Welcome to the Birding for Joy podcast, a show about discovering and exploring all the ways birding and wild birds bring joy into our lives. I'm Candi Lynn Fite, your gracious host and joyful birder. If you're curious about learning more about birding for joy, grab your favorite beverage, settle on your perch, and let's get into today's episode. Spooky greetings, my birdie-ful friends. If you've listened to the show before, welcome back. If this is your first time tuning in, I am so happy you're here. It's October, and today I'm bringing y'all another spooky season episode covering the real-life horrors I uncovered in Alfred Hitchcock's movie, The Birds. In preparation for the episode, I re-watched the 1963 film I first watched as a young adult. My outlook on the movie clashes with how I felt when I originally viewed it. Back then, I considered it a quirky horror flick about killer birds. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, The Birds was similar to other creature features, making wildlife out to be the monsters such as Piranha, Night of the Lepus, Jaws, Cujo, and The Swarm. They were scream and squirm worthy, and several left me with a fear of murky water. Still today, I refuse to swim in water where I can't see my toes. But today, as a birder watching Hitchcock's The Birds, I'm horrified, not of the birds, but of how the birds were portrayed and used. It's a few of the humans involved that disturbed me the most. Aside from rewatching the movie, I spent hours researching information about the making of the movie. Imagine my shock when I discovered several real-life disturbing particulars surrounding the film. So much so that I almost nixed the entire idea of recording an episode about it. As much as the movie attempts to portray the birds as feathered monsters, I can't help but feel that the true monsters were none other than the director himself and Hollywood. Sorry, Hitchcock fans, but reality lies under some unsettling details. In no particular order, because I find them equally as terrible, here are 5 real horrors of Hitchcock's The Birds. Number 1. Despite the studio spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on building mechanical birds to use on set, they ended up using live birds for many of the attack scenes. After reviewing the first tapings, the artificial birds with motorized wings looked too fake. So Hitchcock hired animal trainer Ray Berwick to locate, capture, and train wild birds to feature in the film. At first, this proved difficult, but after several desperate attempts, Berwick and a crew gathered 28,000 live wild birds. They were various species of gulls, crows, ravens, sparrows, and finches. As a Hitchcock movie buff, this fact is probably a thrilling element. Even though the ASPCA was on set the entire time and built an aviary to treat any injured birds, and I couldn't find any information of any bird fatalities on set, as a birder, I still find the whole thing shocking and appalling. And here's why. I am curious as to how and why the studio was able to capture 28,000 wild birds when the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was definitely around in 1963. I couldn't find a single, solitary, valid source of information out there regarding such a blatant violation of the federal law. I did find one thread of posts on Reddit, but I'm not counting it. Even if the studio did obtain a permit to capture and use the birds as animal actors, I wonder whose pockets were lined with Hollywood money to make it happen. In an interview, the trainer, Ray Berwick, claimed that because they trained some of the birds to attack, many crew members and actors were injured during filming. We'll talk more about a specific injury incident regarding the lead actress later in the episode. But the worst part about using wild birds and training some to attack humans is that after the filming was done, these birds were unable to be released back into the wild, nor were they able to be kept as pets. Oddly, I couldn't find any information about what happened to the wild birds after the filming. Number 2. In a 1998 issue of Hello, a celebrity and royalty weekly magazine specializing in celebrity news and human interest stories, they featured an interview article with Australian movie star Rod Taylor, who co-starred with Tippi Hedren, playing Mitch Brenner in The Birds. He told the magazine after he arrived in Hollywood, producer and director Alfred Hitchcock contacted him about starring in the film. He stated, quote, "They'd feed the birds whiskey and wheat. The only reason those birds stayed still was because they were drunk. The other trick was to put raw meat in the lens so the huge ravens would swoop into the camera. They couldn't get away with it now." End quote. I'm assuming by they he meant the director and film crew. Another source reported the film crew admitted to tranquilizing the birds in the final house scene and then tying the birds onto the roof so they couldn't fly away. Does anyone else wonder why the crew got away with drugging the birds with the ASPCA on set? Number 3. Several sources say Alfred Hitchcock's movie The Birds was loosely based on Daphne du Maurier's short story The Birds from her anthology collection titled The Apple Tree. I'm not sure how they can even define the adaptation as loosely, because the only two things that du Maurier's short story and the film have in common are the title and the fact that both involve bird attacks. The film itself actually follows more closely to a real-life event than the author's short story. In a 2021 article in the magazine Popular Science states, in the Santa Cruz Sentinel, August 18, 1961, there is an account of thousands of birds raining down from the sky at 3 a.m., crashing into homes and cars in Capitola and Pleasure Point, California, just off Monterey Bay. 8 persons were reported bitten. The birds reported were sooty shearwaters. Days after the mysterious event, Alfred Hitchcock called the Santa Cruz Sentinel, requesting a copy of that day's paper. He had already enlisted Evan Hunter to write the screenplay adaptation of du Maurier's story, so the filming was already taking place. Less than 2 years later, the movie The Birds premiered. 2 side notes here. In her biography, Manderley Forever, Daphne du Maurier was not shy about her opinion of Hitchcock's film when it was released. She didn't like it, and was quoted saying she is irritated that her name is so rarely mentioned in interviews with the director, end quote. And regarding the 1961 incident with the sooty shearwaters, in 2011, researchers discovered that the birds had most likely ingested fish that had fed on microalgae that produced the domoic acid toxin, which would have caused the birds to become sick and disoriented. Those poor sooty shearwaters were poisoned. They were not killer birds. Horror number 4. I mentioned earlier about how crew members and actors received injuries from the birds on set. But wait until you hear about lead actress Tippi Hedren's horrific experiences during filming. The climactic moment of the movie takes place when Hedren's character Melanie Daniels enters the attic bedroom alone. Hedren believed the particular scene would take place with mechanical birds, so imagine her shock when live birds greeted her instead. The crew and Hitchcock informed her that the artificial birds had malfunctioned and that they had to use live bird actors for the scene. If you've watched the movie and recall this scene, know that many of the injuries that she endured were quite real. According to several online sources, the scene took a week to film, and the birds that weren't tied to her clothing were hurled at her over and over by the crew members wearing protective gauntlet gloves. On day 5 of the taping, as her character lay exhausted on the floor, pecked, scratched, and bleeding, she'd finally had enough. The doctor she saw afterward ordered her a week's rest. Hitchcock attempted to refuse her the break, but the doctor insisted. The following Monday, Hedren returned to the set with her head held high to finish the film. After what she'd already endured during filming with her injuries and Hitchcock himself, Miss Hedren refused him the satisfaction of watching her give up. It's believed that Hitchcock deviously plotted the final scene to punish her for reasons that we'll talk about in a minute. To say that the relationship between Tippi Hedren and Alfred Hitchcock was negative or difficult would be a huge understatement. And that brings us to the 5th and final horrifying truth behind the movie The Birds. The master of suspense morphs into the master of manipulation when it comes to the lead actress of The Birds. In several interviews, Tippi Hedren admits that she believes that Alfred Hitchcock punished her in that last and final horrifying scene because she refused his advances on her. How Alfred Hitchcock used and abused his power to control Miss Hedren during the filming process and afterward is truly disturbing. The most horrifying aspect of the movie isn't the idea of wild birds attacking humans. It's learning about the strange obsession the film's director had with his lead actress. While it's true that nature can be wild, unpredictable, and dangerous, no apex predator in the wild is more terrifying than a human predator. After all my research, I will never be able to look at the film or Alfred Hitchcock himself the same way again. As I mentioned in the beginning, I almost didn't follow through with this episode, because what I thought would be a quirky, fun episode for the spooky season turned into real-life creepy instead. Not my normal joyful vibe, for sure. It felt a bit true crime-ish in a way. But in the end, I decided to follow through. If you're interested in following up on the subject, I will link a couple of my sources into the show notes. Also, let me add this disclaimer. The thoughts and opinions in today's episode are of my own. The information featured in the episode was gathered for research by yours truly. Sources consist of online articles, online interviews, and online videos. Join me next week for the final spooky season episode about cemetery birding. Until then, I wish you well and joyful birding, my friends. If you are enjoying the Birding for Joy podcast, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to the show. Subscribing and tuning in to the episodes lets the algorithm on each platform know the podcast is providing you worthwhile content. It also helps ensure the success of the show. Remember, the absolute best way to support your favorite podcast is by word of mouth. So make sure to share Birding for Joy with others who might enjoy listening. That way we continue to build a joyful birding community. As always, thank you for tuning in and stay chirpy, my friends.